My grandfather sailed out of here for several trips. And one of them, he was making ready for the second one of that particular month when they would go offshore to the banks. These were dory fishing schooners of old. And he fell sick the night before the trip began. Consequently, he missed the trip. And nothing was ever seen again of either the vessel or any of the crew. They were lost with all hands. And that I remember his telling me about very clearly when I would sit in his shed, summer times in Campobello, when he'd whittle boats and spin sea yarns to me or with me. And it was a full summer of joy with him.
Hello, I'm the Reverend Brett Hays. Welcome to Part 3 of our History of St. John's, Gloucester. This segment covers the years when St. John's was guided by her longest-serving rector, the Reverend Joseph H.C. Cooper. The Reverend Cooper presided over the construction of the critically needed Parrish Hall. It was a time when the famous family of John Hays Hammond, friend and advisor to several presidents, worshipped at St. John's alongside the families from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. It was a time when World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic would claim the lives of many men from Gloucester and make heroes out of others. And before the Reverend Cooper retired in 1936, St. John's and Gloucester would suffer through the Great Depression. In our story, you will also learn how the man who did the most to get us out of the Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had a personal connection with Gloucester.
Joseph Holland Collier Cooper came to St. John's on January 28, 1908. A former Methodist, he had the reputation of being the best preacher in western Massachusetts. Looking to make a move, Bishop Lawrence offered him a choice of two parishes. Not being familiar with either, Cooper asked the bishop, "If you were in my position, which parish would you choose?" To which Lawrence replied, "Why, Gloucester, by all means. It holds the possibilities of a good future." 50 years later, in May of 1963, Father Cooper's nephew, Reverend Roy Grindy, was invited to provide the sermon to commemorate St. John's 100th anniversary. As a boy, Grindy summered in Gloucester with his uncle, staying in the rectory on Washington Street. He described the Reverend as athletic in build and bold in courage. The English-born Cooper wasn't above breaking up a drunken brawl if he happened upon one down on the waterfront on a Saturday night. According to Grindy, Cooper's pastoral mission emphasized that love and loyalty to the Lord were paramount, and that in worship and practice, all things should be done in decency and in order. On August 8, 1910, Reverend Cooper gave the principal address at the memorial service for newly lost fishermen, an annual affair prepared by the Fishermen's Institute. After the procession made its way down to Stagefort Park, Institute President Colonel Wanson performed the reading of the names. When it was Cooper's turn to speak, he told the crowd,
"So long as Gloucester remains a fishing port, And these brave and hardy sons of the sea go forth, taking their lives in their hands. So long as storms and hurricanes rage over the face of the waters, sending home the vessels with the flag at half-mast, that mute sign of battle or death on the remorseless deep, or occasions their returning never again. So long will it remain the least the people of Gloucester can do to meet in this, or some such manner, once a year, and pay their tribute of respect and sorrow to her fishermen lost at sea.
A few minutes later, Cooper showed his revulsion for the seedier aspects of the fish town.
It is a well-known fact that very many of these young men who go out on Gloucester's fishing boats come to us from the provinces, where they have been reared in Christian homes amid clean and wholesome surroundings, but ashore in Gloucester visibly deteriorate, falling victims to the human sharks lying in wait for them among our wharves, tempted into some one of the many hellholes whose existence we tolerate. I repeat that we tolerate, for these places exist by our consent, and to say, as some people in Gloucester do say, that we must allow these things, or we shall drive the fishermen away, is at once to libel the fishermen, and to admit our own sordid greed and cowardice.
St. John's Church was flourishing, having nearly doubled its assets in the preceding 5 years. This was the result of Gloucester's transformation into a summer resort for wealthy businessmen and their families, by the attention of Bishop Lawrence, who was adept at procuring donations from the upper class, and from a series of rectors who actively ministered to these summer residents, which ultimately resulted in generous donations of much-needed working capital. And minister they did, having found out that the many large Magnolia and Eastern Point hotels were just full of people who would attend services if they didn't have to commute all the way down to Middle Street. Services were held in 5 separate locations throughout the day on Sundays. Supply priests who summered on Cape Ann covered Union Chapel and Magnolia and the Grandview Hotel in Annisquam. Cooper himself would cover 2 or 3 services at St. John's and evening services at the Fishermen's Institute and the Hawthorne Inn Casino in East Gloucester, which would draw guests from the Moorland Hotel at Bass Rocks and from the many guest houses. Between 200 and 300 guests might attend a single evening service at the casino. The huge Colonial Arms Hotel on Eastern Point burned to the ground 3 weeks before Cooper came to town.
This was the period when a good many of the presidents would have their summer residences in the neighborhood. Usually Beverly Farms, a big house would be rented for them. And they'd come over here as part of their beat, as they did in the summer, and they would amuse themselves by, somebody would put on a clam bake or something like that. But there was a string of Republican presidents. It was also the years when the fishing schooners were becoming more and more irrelevant as far as fishing was concerned. The landings of fish were still pretty good because by now, when they gave up the dories, they took up nets, which would sweep the ocean and bring up everything indiscriminately. Another thing that happened was that in 1914, the Canadians, the men from the Maritimes, as I said, the provinces, stopped coming. They joined the British Army and died in thousands in the trenches in World War I. Canada had 3 whole divisions, much more than she should have for the population because so many died. And that, in combination with the fact they no longer needed dorymen, meant that the kind of speech that Cooper gave when he first got here about the notorious neighborhoods of Gloucester, by which he meant Duncan's Point, became irrelevant. The place cleaned up.
John Hays Hammond Sr. had to be the most illustrious of the St. John's members in these days. A close college friend of President William Howard Taft, his name was offered for vice president in 1908, but he failed to round up enough delegates at the Republican convention. He declined offers to be Secretary of the Navy and ambassador to China. From South African gold mines to California oil, Hammond had a Midas touch, and when he wasn't off chatting business with world leaders like the Tsar of Russia or staying in one of his other homes, Hammond could be seen Sunday mornings at St. John's. Plus, he was a major benefactor of the church. By the 1910 annual meeting, Father Cooper could report that 1909 had offered 18 baptisms, 7 marriages, 8 burials, and 2 churchings of women. Along with managing 209 services, Cooper made 400 pastoral visits. 6 months earlier, on Wednesday afternoon, July 28th, Reverend Cooper and the vestry met in the Thompson Room to discuss the most urgent problems at hand, a woesome lack of space. The Thompson Room had been built as a vesting area for the choir and was too small to house large meetings, multiple Sunday school classes, or an office for the rector. Mary Younger Brown, a parishioner who owned the adjoining lot to the rear of the church, had been approached years before and offered $600 for her property. That Wednesday in July, the vestry voted to purchase the land, build a parish house of modest expense, and also forge ahead with other necessary renovations. Local architect Herman Spooner was hired to design the building. On September 17th, Miss Younger Brown sold the lot and house on Gould Court to St. John's for the sum of $1. The next day, the rector and the vestry approved Spooner's design, and the project was put out to bid, later choosing Benjamin Clark as contractor. The proposed building's amenities included a comfortable parlor with a fireplace made from pasture rocks, several rooms for the Sunday school, an administrative office, a well-appointed kitchen, and on the second floor, an auditorium with seating for 250 people. The basement would boast a Mercer steam boiler with coal pockets run on 2 circuits, so the church or parish hall could be heated independently. The kitchen and bathrooms were to be fitted with both cold and hot water, and there was space in the basement to allow for a small gymnasium. There was a lift or dumbwaiter which allowed for the passage of supplies from the lower side delivery entrance, off what is now the parking lot, to be quickly brought to the kitchen a floor above, and the auditorium a floor above that. Bishop Lawrence was on hand a year later, in October of 1910, at the parish hall's grand opening, making the trip from Boston by motor car. Lawrence had contributed $2,000 from his diocesan reinforcement fund as seed money for the project. Eventually, $15,000 was raised over the following 5 years to pay for these expenses. The Gloucester Daily Times provided an elaborate description of the new building and marveled at how well it met the many needs of the congregation. The additional improvements, which would be completed over the following years, would include a new pulpit, a chancel rail, stained glass windows, and by 1919, the exterior stuccoing of the church. Stewardship was handled by the St. John's Guild. They helped raise a great deal of money needed for renovation of the church and for equipping the parish house. Guild members made frequent calls on parishioners, and where needed, supplied them with groceries and clothing. With the parish hall finished, new organizations proliferated. The Altar Guild, Grace Thompson's St. Agnes Guild for Girls, the Men's Club, a Couples Club, the Girls' Friendly Society, the Young People's Fellowship, and by 1932, the Newfoundland Society. Like his parents, John Hays Hammond Jr., who was known as Jack, was a member of St. John's. As a boy, he developed a passion for inventing after his father took him on a visit to meet the great Thomas Edison. Later at Yale, he was mentored by Alexander Graham Bell. After college, he worked for a time at the U.S. Patent Office, a shrewd move that taught him where to find technological opportunities. When he returned home, his father built a laboratory on their property, Lookout Hill, for Jack to perform his wireless experiments. These included the remote piloting of an unmanned motorboat around Gloucester Harbor, which frightened some of the locals. He made his first fortune in 1916, selling to the U.S. government patents for radio-controlled torpedoes. Today, he is considered the father of radio control. When Jack wasn't deep at work in his laboratory, he socialized on Eastern Point with a bohemian group of artists and intellectuals who were members of Boston society. Among them was A.Piatt Andrew, an economics instructor at Harvard, who taught Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Piatt Andrew went on to direct the U.S. Mint and serve as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for William Howard Taft. Andrew's particular friend was Henry Sleeper, a nationally noted antiquarian and interior decorator who built the lavish home Beauport next door after visiting Andrew's Red Roof on Eastern Point. Beauport was expanded several times before 1925 and became the major showcase for Sleeper's interior design and decoration business. Isabella Stewart Gardner, John Singer Sargent, and Henry James could be found at Sleeper's Beauport gatherings. Among the younger members of this group was Jack Hammond's close friend Leslie Buswell, an English actor with royal connections. Buswell had a mind for the sciences, but it was his dramatic skills that got him invited on a 1913 American tour, which eventually landed him in Gloucester. When World War I broke out, he quit the stage to help Jack Hammond with his experiments in radio communication. But soon he was called away to France to help out A.Piatt Andrew. When war in Europe broke out in 1914, the American colony of Parrish organized a temporary field hospital to help the wounded soldiers at the front get medical care. The French word for this type of mobile medical unit was ambulance, but we associate this term with the vehicles used to move the wounded. 1914 was the first time volunteers would have access to motorized Ford Model T trucks to transport wounded soldiers, a big improvement over horse-drawn wagons. Two of these early volunteer drivers, going to France 3 years before the U.S. entered the war, were A.Piatt Andrew and Leslie Buswell. By 1915, Piatt Andrew had forged an agreement with the French High Command to allow them to work at the front lines. This marked the formal beginning of the American Ambulance Field Service. Later, ambulance was dropped from the name when the U.S. entered the war and the field service expanded to include military transport. We know it today by its nickname AFS, the organization that sponsors international foreign exchange. These Gloucester friends, Piatt Andrew, Buswell, and Henry Sleeper, were instrumental in the growth of the American Field Service to an organization with over 2,500 wartime volunteers. Sleeper was responsible for raising donations and facilitating the recruitment of young men from American colleges and universities. The volunteers often served under extremely dangerous combat conditions, and by the end of the war, some 127 had been killed. The French would award the Legion of Honor to both A.Piatt Andrew and Henry Sleeper. Buswell's work as an ambulance driver and his acts of valor crawling out into no man's land at night to drag wounded men to safety, earned him a French Croix de Guerre. His letters to Sleeper and others back in America described in harrowing detail a first-person account of the war. Recognizing their inspirational value, the letters were collectively published under the title Ambulance Number 10. The book gained such interest that Buswell came back and did a fundraising lecture tour. Between the book sales and the lectures, he raised over $500,000 for the American Field Service. Chester Grant was among the men who left Gloucester for Europe in 1918 and saw action in the Battle of Chateau Thierry. On the morning of July 18, 1918, American forces led by General Blackjack Pershing, along with the French, launched a counter-assault against the German positions, the first in over a year. Chester Grant was part of the famed Yankee Division, which performed a surprise over-the-top charge out of the trenches. Although only in combat for the last 6 months of the war, Americans suffered 20% casualties, Chester Grant among them. He received the Silver Star and a French Croix de Guerre for bravery in battle. Grant would spend the next 35 years in community service, geared largely towards veterans' affairs, and was a major figure in Gloucester politics. He ran for mayor in the 1940s. He was a respected and outspoken city councilor when he died in 1954. His funeral was held at St. John's, and he is buried at Locust Grove Cemetery. We remember him today as the person after whom Grant Circle is named. In 1918, with the U.S. involved in combat in the last few months of the war, an outbreak of the influenza virus became the most serious pandemic in recorded history. The 1918 Spanish flu was responsible for 50 to 100 million deaths. Ironically, two factors pertaining to the war contributed to its lethal spread. One was that young American servicemen were grouped together in close living quarters, whether on base or on trains or troop ships. The other factor was that the modernization of these transport systems facilitated the spread of the virus from one continent to many. First reported in January at an Army post in Kansas, by August, a more virulent strain appeared simultaneously in France, Sierra Leone, and Boston. One of its victims was St. John's parishioner Phillips Haskell. Phillips was a graduate of Dartmouth College who married Ruth Bradley and lived next door to the rectory at 163 Washington Street. When the U.S. entered the war, he joined the Navy Reserve and was assigned to the Naval Training Camp in Hingham as a chief quartermaster. Sometime in August, he was exposed to the virus. He was quarantined at the Gallops Island Naval Hospital in Boston Harbor and died of pneumonia on September 29th. He is buried at Oak Grove Cemetery. Phillips Haskell's name can be found on the Joan of Arc statue, which A.Piatt Andrew helped get erected in 1921 to honor the Gloucester men sacrificed in World War I. We also remember Phillips Haskell by the silver chalice that his mother Emma gave in his memory after the war. A.Piatt Andrew went on to win the seat in Congress that he held until his untimely death in 1936. On July 4, 1953, 2 years after Gloucester was finally connected to Route 128, the high bridge built to span the Annisquam River was named in his honor. John Hammond Jr. renewed his research partnership with Leslie Buswell and went on to create over 400 inventions. Jack would also be famous for spending a significant portion of his wealth building Hammond Castle, which exemplified his love of the romantic beauty of ancient Europe. Nearby, Leslie Buswell built Stillington Hall, a replica of his family's 16th century English manor house, still one of Gloucester's most distinctive residences. When Leslie was in town, he could be found Sunday mornings at St. John's and would often participate in reading one of the lessons. Buswell later became a colonel in the Army Air Corps and received a Bronze Star and a second Croix de Guerre for his efforts in World War II. He died in 1964 after a full life in the service of others. After services at St. John's and his church in Miami Beach, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. We remember him by the antique Dutch stained glass windows that he donated in 1957 in memory of his parents. They are located in the narthex as you enter the church. Gloucester's elaborate tricentennial celebration was held at Stagefort Park in 1923. Event organizers asked local clergymen to come and reflect on those contributions their congregations had made over those 300 years since the Anglican John Lyford fled Plymouth for Cape Ann. When Cooper's time came to speak, he wasted no time in presenting a somewhat grandiose version of the role of Episcopalians in the founding of Gloucester. But his words reflect the general feeling of the time, that it was no accident that the English-speaking races were dominating the world.
And we, Episcopalians, may take pride that it was in the mind of an Episcopal clergyman that the plan was born of founding a colony, and this same man's enthusiasm and effort which carried it through. Since we have been requested to speak of the part our respective religious organizations have played in the history and life of Gloucester, may we not take pride in this fact? May not we Episcopalians take particular pleasure in remembering at this time that it was in the womb of the Mother Church of the English-speaking races that this colony was born, and that from her breasts was drawn the first spiritual sustenance of a people destined to become great.
Cooper goes on to lament that it took nearly 250 years for an Episcopal church to actually be built in Gloucester, but then his message hit a poignant note as he discussed the great toll of sorrow, suffering, and life the industry has extracted.
For the thought of the many who, in the pursuit of this noble industry, have sailed away, never to come back, of the wives who have waited in vain for the homecoming of their husbands, of the children who have been left fatherless, of the watchings, the anxieties, the heartaches and the heartbreaks that have run through the pursuit of fishing back through these 300 years, makes our rejoicing to mingle with sadder thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, I think that 1923, as far as Gloucester was concerned, was the top of the Anglophile expression. And in the Episcopal Church, this was a period that my grandfather, who was the Bishop of Pennsylvania from 1913 to 1923, resigned as bishop and became the first warden of the College of Preachers of the National Cathedral in Washington. They had, as it turned out, of course, irrational idea, I think, in the backs of their minds that Episcopalianism would become the established church in some way. The College of Preachers was founded on All Souls College at Oxford, and they were teaching young clergy to really make use of the radio and of modern kinds of communication to give the idea, certainly, that the Episcopal point of view was the best. The National Cathedral was to be the sort of Westminster Abbey of America. In fact, the only president who was buried there was Woodrow Wilson. Ben Pine, I can't remember exactly when he was born, but he came out of a little tiny town in Newfoundland. Most of the men who came here were from Nova Scotia, but every once in a while you'd get some incredibly tough customer from Newfoundland.
Ben Pine was a vessel manager. He was an outfitter. He operated a very successful company that took care of at least 30% of the fishing fleet in Gloucester. By that I mean the Nova Scotian Canadian people all gravitated to his wharf because he was one of them. He talked the same language. But aside from being a fisherman, Ben Pine was a natural leader, and he was a businessman extraordinaire, and he knew the value of publicity and public relations, and he was born to lead the Gloucester fisheries as far as the Nova Scotian Canadian Maritime segment of the industry. There's a long history associated with the schooner races. It goes way back to the early 1900s. And of course, the rivalry was intense when fishing on the banks because the Nova Scotian vessels only had to travel out 50, 60 miles, and they were on the fishing banks. The Gloucester vessels had to travel 300, 400, 500 miles, 1,000 miles to get to the Grand Banks. So they needed to be sleeker and faster in comparison because they had to make market.
Mr. Thibault made his fortune in taxicabs, I think, and he came to Gloucester, stayed in one of the big hotels, and got very bored. So luckily, he got in a local taxicab and said, "Take me somewhere, more or less, where I won't be bored. I want to hear about the sea." And the driver took him to the Master Mariners. We had a wonderful time talking to all the old salts who had been skippers of the boats. And they explained to him about this this sailing competition, this racing competition. So he paid for the Thibault. I think she cost $75,000 when you could get a very decent fishing boat for about 25. Named for Mr. Thibault's wife, Gertrude. She was built as a racing boat. She really had no particular fishing purpose anymore. But there was a lot of competition between the men who stayed in the Maritimes and the men who came down here and fished from Gloucester and lived in Gloucester.
When the competition started up, these same Canadians in Gloucester, now newly minted U.S. citizens, were really sailing in competition against their uncles and fathers and grandfathers down in Nova Scotia. So it was like one big family, except for the competitive part, and they weren't to be outdone in Nova Scotia by any of their grandsons or sons in the United States.
And eventually, the provincial government of Nova Scotia had the Blue Nose built. And the Thibault and the Blue Nose went at it through the 1930s.
Bishop Rhinelander had summered on Eastern Point for over 20 years. He not only attended St. John's for Sunday services, but took an active role advising Reverend Cooper and the vestry whenever he could. By the late 1920s, St. John's was again feeling constrained by physical space limitations, and talk commenced about rebuilding the church. The Universalists next door rejected an offer to sell their land in back of the sanctuary. The idea of rebuilding the church from scratch was considered and rejected. Bishop Rhinelander personally hired architect Norman Sturgis to come up with a design for expanding the sanctuary to accommodate 300 people from the 220 it then held. The Sturgis plan extended the entrance closer to Middle Street and put a transept off the right side in front of the outside entrance of the Thompson Room. Being very concerned about the cosmetic appearance of both the interior and exterior, he recommended a stone archway dividing the nave from the sanctuary over the communion rail to, in his words, form a frame for the altar. The exterior stucco, which Sturgis described as neither appropriate nor of sufficient permanence for a church in this climate, would be faced in Cape Ann granite and trimmed with Indiana limestone. The plan was ultimately scrapped for lack of funds. The Depression was in its early stages, and many of the wealthy parishioners, always the best source for funding capital improvements, had been hammered by the stock market collapse. Their temperament for St. John's expansion is best illustrated by the letter the Special Building Committee received from Natalie, the wife of John Hays Hammond, Sr.
My husband and I feel strongly that this is not the time to consider enlarging the church. Indeed, we are most emphatically opposed to this venture and wish to put ourselves on record that we will lend no financial aid. Times are hard, labor costly, and our congregation inadequate during 2/3 of the year to require or support a larger edifice.
"4 days before the presidential election in 1932, Howard Blackburn, the very symbol of the tenacious Gloucester fishermen, died. In the period after the turn of the century, Blackburn had become one of Gloucester's most important businessmen, and until the end, continued to give money to destitute fishermen and their families. The day of his funeral, every flag in Gloucester was lowered to half-mast. The cortege, which consisted of 250 schooner captains and fishermen, followed by 40 Coast Guardsmen and dignitaries from all levels of government, took his body from inside his beloved Blackburn Tavern, and to the sound of muffled drums, slowly moved down Main Street. The honorary pallbearers included Secretary of the Navy Charles Francis Adams, Congressman A.Piatt Andrew, John Hays Hammond Sr., who occasionally went down to Main Street to sit with Howard and listen to his wonderful stories, and Sir William Grenfell, who was knighted by King George V for his medical missionary work in Newfoundland and Labrador. The procession wound its way up Middle Street, ending at St. John's, where, in Joseph Garland's words, the air was sweet with flowers, and every pew was packed. Howard was buried at Fisherman's Rest in West Gloucester.
I was born here in Gloucester. We lived in various parts of town. It was Depression times. You moved where you could find a rental. And of course, it was that time when, if you look at the pictures of St. John's back, you never saw a woman or a girl in the choir. And it was a simple life. People thought more of centralizing even their extracurricular activities within the church. The church was very much centered to people's lives back then than it is today. And when they gathered for instance, decorate the church on Christmas time, it wasn't a matter of money. Somebody had a truck, and the young folks would gather, and we would take a lunch. And we would go up like Dogtown Common or someplace and collect the greens, probably have a picnic somewhere, and come back. And then it would be announced that they would meet in the basement of the church. And the young folks and the old folks, it was more of a gathering of younger and old folks back then. Mrs. Moulton was quite active in the Women's Auxiliary. They had the Newfoundland Society, because a lot of St. John's people were Newfoundlanders. And we had wonderful times. And her fish chowders, if baked fish suppers were the top thing. We had a wonderful time.
By 1933, the number of Gloucester citizens on relief doubled. There was, of course, no social security, and the city's welfare system, the poor farm, was a remnant of colonial times. But it was restricted to helpless elderly and indigent citizens, a system that had no proviso for healthy, able-bodied men. Nearly 4,000 men and women were unemployed in the city of 24,000. 263 children were unable to attend public school for lack of clothing or shoes, and it was up to the churches and the service clubs to do whatever they could to meet this need.
My mother sent a note over to my aunt, who lived in East Gloucester, and said that she didn't have so much as a loaf of bread in the house. And I remember my aunt she had hens, and every once in a while I would go over on the bus and get a bucket load of eggs. And I'll forget one time I was on the bus, and one man said to me, "Child, what are you going to do with all those eggs?" What did he think in that time and age what I was going to do with them? I was going to eat them, not myself, but the family. But whatever she had extra, she would send it over. There are times that we went to bed with a piece of bread with molasses and probably had a cup of milk with it. Yeah. So to get a main meal, we had our main meal at noontime. It was mostly fish, or it was eggs, or whatever you could, or reused fish from the day before, and something like that.
My grandparents knew the Roosevelts because the island of 1,000 people, everyone knows one another. The Roosevelts came occasionally in the summer, and they had a large cottage there. And so my grandfather was an obvious person of the sea who was employed by Mr. James Roosevelt to skipper the Half Moon, a 40-foot English cutter by design, by sail design, which means it had a great big mainsail and a fairly small jib, but a boom that hung way off after the stern. But he had been on the sea all his life, and he was a native of Campobello, and he had worked for other yachtsmen. Turn of the century, I guess it would have been when he worked there, because FDR then was a young man, young 14-year-old fella. My grandfather taught him how to sail. And 2 generations later, my grandfather taught me how to sail. So both FDR and I had the same teachers in the art of sailing and navigating around the tricky waters of Campobello and the Bay of Fundy.
Roosevelt had been elected in November. The Depression was just awful all over the country. Everything, they thought the banks were failing. People were just about starving. There was despair in the country. And the first 100 days just made a tremendous difference. You could see this in the newspapers, even though the Gloucester Times didn't like Roosevelt. There was energy in Washington. There were all sorts of social services suddenly put into place. There was new hope.
In that desperate spring of 1933, A.Piatt Andrew worked behind the scenes with Captain Ben Pine, veteran of the great schooner races, to create publicity for Gloucester's plight. They were hoping to convince Congress that a tariff on imported Canadian fish would secure the survival of the Gloucester fishermen.
Ben Pine with help from Gloucester, had the bright idea that he would take the T-boat to Washington to make a special plea for the fishermen. They sailed in up the Potomac, and there was the president and Mrs. Roosevelt out on the presidential yacht. So they tooted away and they waved, and the president waved back, and Mrs. Roosevelt waved back, and they tied up. Mrs. Roosevelt climbed over every bit of the T-boat and reported back to the president. She invited the whole family for tea. A.Piatt Andrew had more or less engineered the whole thing. He was our representative. He managed to get in petitions and all sorts of things. It didn't do any good as far as the fishermen were concerned, but it certainly got publicity.
Who would ever think of sailing a vessel to the World's Fair, Chicago World's Fair, or sailing the vessel in the doldrums of the Depression to Washington, D.C. to meet President Roosevelt and promote the industry as a whole for all of New England, not just Gloucester, but for New England. He was a giant in his time. He was everything to the community. He was everything to the industry, and yet he could bring himself right down to the individual and be right with the ordinary man on the street. He was liked by everybody.
So now we cut to June, when the president is finally free. With great anxiety in Gloucester, because Ben craftily had persuaded Emil Gruppe, probably the best of our artists of the time, lived on Rocky Neck, to paint a picture of the T-boat under sail. They were very anxious that the president would stop off in Gloucester. And in fact, she turned up in this rented yacht. A.Piatt Andrew could hardly wait. He rushed off to welcome her. Ben Pine came out, and they presented the president with the painting. A.Piatt Andrew had been FDR's tutor at Harvard. He majored in economics graduated in 1903, I think. So there were all sorts of reasons.
When I was in the Boy Scouts, and we served as honor guard for FDR when he came ashore for his visit. And I think that was the last time he appeared on Campobello in the early 30s, during his first term. We were fully dressed in Boy Scout uniform and on the wharf, and gave him a royal welcome, as was both necessary and honorable to be able to do, and I remember that very well.
Of all the programs that were instituted in Roosevelt's first 100 days, 4 in particular had a notable effect on Gloucester. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, utilized unemployed young men and veterans to improve open space and recreational facilities like state parks. Along with providing shelter, food, and clothing, these men were paid $30 per month, of which all but $5 was sent home to their families. More ambitious was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which carried out public works projects, constructing buildings, bridges, and roads. In Gloucester, WPA money resulted in the post office on Dale Avenue, the State Fishing Pier, and the high school off Centennial Avenue. But much of the WPA money came to Gloucester in the way of smaller improvements that would help to enrich the life of the community. Playgrounds, baseball fields, and basketball courts were places where children could be taught courtesy and safety. Courses in woodworking and crafts were also offered, as well as navigation for the young men interested in the merchant marine.
My mother was a homemaker, but she did work on the WPA. And the reason, because it was the Depression and had to have the extra income. After school, I would go down and wait in front of the post office. The post office then was where Brown's building is today. And I would wait for her to come up from, it was around the waterfront there in the Roger Street area that the building was. And she would meet me my mother would meet me at the post office and go home. The WPA where she worked, they made clothing. And a lot of the clothing I wore to school came from the WPA. But I thought nothing of it. I wasn't even ashamed of it. It was a common thing. A lot of people would be screaming socialism, but I don't think Roosevelt was a socialist. He was far from a socialist. He was a genuine capitalist. It was just a matter of knowing how to financially put your money where you get your best results.
By December of 1933, with the strong support of Mrs. Roosevelt, the President set up the Public Works of Art program, the PWAP. Though its purpose was to support artists impoverished by the Depression, as a bonus, it created professional art on the walls of public buildings. Charles Allen Winter was chosen for murals in City Hall. He made some sketches from photographs of local people and utilized 8 recent mayors as models for the first town council. In one scene, Winter offered his vision of Gloucester's yet unrealized dream of the high bridge over the Ennisquam River. In the welfare mural, a small boy receives a new pair of shoes from a goddess, discarding his worn-out pair. With her other hand, the goddess pushes a basket of food towards a group including a woman and child, with a productive factory in the background. Winter's use of allegory reflects his socialist background, and although old-fashioned by 1937, was still popular. Restored in 2013, these paintings continue to be a local treasure. Until 1935, the United States was the only modern industrial country without a national system of Social Security. With the majority of the New Deal programs designed to provide only short-term relief, the Social Security Act has to be one of the most significant parts of Roosevelt's pre-war legacy. Social Security not only established a permanent system of universal retirement pensions, but also provided welfare for the handicapped and for fatherless children. At Roosevelt's insistence, it was funded by payroll taxes rather than from the general fund, so as, in his words, to give the contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect their pensions and unemployment benefits.
I do remember back when Reverend Cooper was here, and I remember when he was left and how everybody was sad that he was leaving. Of course, they realized it was time for him to go. We don't all stay around forever, none of us. So anyway, but he had a very good reputation and was very much loved in the parish. He just had that person about him that the children knew that he was there like a shepherd for them. And the adults respected him for his authority. There's a time they wanted to get card playing in the church. No way. If you can't, there were Sunday night services, you know. And he told them right out, you can't come to church on Sunday night. You're not going to come here to gamble. He was very strict, but he's very kind, and he was what you call a real caring pastor.
On November 29, 1936, Reverend Cooper performed his final service after having completed the longest pastorate in St. John's history, serving 28 years. With nearly 200 parishioners in attendance, Cooper voiced his profound appreciation for the universal kindness, loyalty, and sympathetic cooperation given him by the parish. He pleaded to those present, "Be loyal to your church. Remain loyal. Be loyal to each other." Cooper retired the next day and planned to live in their Forest Street home in Manchester, working as a supply priest after wintering in Vero Beach, Florida. Reverend Robert N. Rodenmeyer was chosen to take his place as rector. It was in Vero Beach that Cooper died just 4 months later on April 8th. Cooper had always been regarded as physically fit, and he frequented the Gloucester YMCA to play athletic games, but unfortunately had developed problems with angina in the final year of his life. The Reverend W.F.A. Stride of Christ Church, Hamilton and Wenham, his close friend, eulogized him at St. John's, saying,
"Setting aside the ambition of personal advancement, he devoted himself for all but a few months of his service in the Episcopal Church to the needs of one parish. Outside of that parish, he was little known, for he set himself with a single mind to a single objective, on which he concentrated all his energies. His work was unselfish and self-sacrificing. He had the capacity to clothe deep thought in simple and memorable words, and so gave both a spiritual and mental sustenance to those who heard him."
Senior warden and organist Myron Tarr said of Cooper,
"As a friend, no one could be more loyal, generous, and kind. In countless ways, he helped gladly all who came in trouble to him. His love for children, especially the very young, evidenced in part by the short, beautiful, extemporaneous prayers at the altar in their behalf, was deeply moving."
Cooper was an active member of the St. Anne's Parsons Club and had a close connection with most of the ministers in Gloucester. Reverend Miles Kiley of St. Anne's Catholic Church told the Gloucester Daily Times, "I am deeply grieved to learn of his death. His kindly manner and helpful counsel endeared him to all." Joseph Cooper was survived by his wife Flora, his adult sons Kenneth and Raphael, and 3 grandchildren. We remember him with the St. Paul window, installed in 1953, in appreciation of his ministry.